I am so glad you're here. Sometimes all we need is a calming voice and a story to comfort us. Imagine it is night, one of those nights that seem suspended in time, when the silence is as thick as velvet and every sound seems more intimate than it should be. You are lying down, perhaps in your bed, perhaps just thinking. In the distance, almost imperceptible, the sound of a string being plucked emerges. A single note, like the whisper of a forgotten past. It is an ancient, ancestral sound that crosses the centuries like a light breeze passing through a closed room. It does not come to attract attention, nor to move. It comes to sustain, to lull, to remind you that before hospitals, before modern science, there was instinct, and among the instruments of survival, there was music. When I think about medical treatments of the past, I can't help but feel a little chill. Not the shiver of fear, but the one born of strangeness, like someone who finds a letter in a forgotten language, and yet feels that it belongs. There was pain, yes. There was blood, improvisation, faint hope. But there was also beauty. There were men and women trying to care for each other with what they had. Hands, cloths, herbs, and sound. A sound that did not come to heal the body, but to put the soul to sleep, even if only for a few minutes. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to keep breathing. Today, at the beginning of this night, I want you to travel to that other time. A time when anesthesia was made of melody, where troubadours sat next to surgeons, in which art, so fragile, sustained the mind when the body could no longer bear it. It may look ridiculous, even beautiful, or maybe both, but the past is like that, full of contradictions that only reveal themselves when we look at it calmly, without rushing, like someone observing the marks on the pages of an old book. This is not a video about medical nonsense told out loud. It's a long whisper of what sustained us, even in the darkest days. Have you ever imagined waking up from surgery without knowing if you survived? Have you ever thought about what it would be like to hear a repetitive melody playing in the background while someone sawed your bones? It may seem brutal, but for many it was a comfort. For others, a final invisible embrace. History is full of absurdities that, when told in a low voice, become less grotesque and more human. The sound that anesthetizes, not with chemistry, but with memory, not with precision, but with presence. So close your eyes. Let this story come to you like a gentle mist, from a time when hallways had no electric light and anesthesiologists used ropes instead of syringes. A time when survival was not a protocol, but an everyday miracle wrapped in sounds that were not meant to last, but did anyway. And now, all you have to do is listen. I remember, with the kind of memory that perhaps comes from another life, a narrow room where time seemed to breathe with difficulty. The walls, made of wood darkened by years of smoke and sweat, closed in on the space like an uncomfortable embrace. Inside, the world was reduced to a smell of rusty iron, a creaking sound coming from the crooked floor, a spent candle trying in vain to illuminate the faces around. In the center of the scene rested a plank, not a bed, not an altar, but a place where flesh met its fate. His breathing was coming in short gasps. Tension was a scent that everyone exuded. And the sound was everything. He arrived before the pain, maybe to announce it, maybe to face her. There was a man. His eyes were calm, as if he no longer expected anything. He sat with an old lute on his lap, his fingers accustomed to the gesture that repeats, day after day, the same note. I didn't play for pleasure. He played as a profession. But it was more than that. He played for mercy, because I knew that, in a moment, there would be a scream, that the blade would ask no question, and the flesh would have no time to negotiate. And that's why I played before. It played during. It would play later. Its sound didn't fill the room. It would be impossible to overcome the thick silence of that place. But it created a rift, a gap between the now and the place where the spirit took refuge. It was through this gap that patients escaped, for seconds, for minutes, for eternity. Back then, medicine was a craft of faith, and improvisation. There were no syringes, no sedatives, no protocol. There was courage, there was desperation, and there was music. Because when all else failed, it was the melody that remained. The blade cut, the blood gushed, the pain happened, but the music sustained the invisible. It sustained what the eyes could not see. There was something deeply moving in seeing that lute resisting the brutality of the metal. It was the human response to what humanity did not yet know how to solve. A small instrument facing catastrophe with strings. And somehow, that was enough. Maybe not to save the leg, but to save the soul from complete collapse. Many said that the sound helped to distract, but it wasn't distraction. It was immersion. The patient didn't stop feeling pain. He just felt it differently, as if it stopped being a threat and became a portal. A place where consciousness floated, where identity dissolved to long-repeated ancestral notes. Some cried without knowing why. Others mumbled verses that didn't exist, and there were those who, even under the steel, murmured along. It wasn't courage. It was poetic surrender. It was as if, faced with the certainty of suffering, the only possible gesture was to accompany it with beauty. The lute didn't fight against the pain. It cradled it. And there was another detail. The choice of melody was not random. There were specific songs for cuts, for burn, for the slowness of the needle or the rush of the saw. There were songs that reminded one of childhood, and others that came from the war. The musician or healer of the soul, as he was sometimes called, knew this. He knew that each note was a thread, and that this thread, however fragile, could tie the patient the present, or gently release him. In some cases, it was the patient himself who asked for the song, as if he needed that path to get through hell, as if, without it, he wouldn't know where to step. Some say this is a legend, that it is an exaggeration, that no one can forget pain with just sound. But I saw it, or maybe I dreamed it. I saw men waking up from primitive surgeries with no memory of the horror, only with the echo of music. I saw mothers holding their children in their arms, not crying for their wound, but for the melody that had sustained them. I saw old men begging to die listening to the sound of the lute, not for its beauty, but because it reminded them of the time when they were still whole. And perhaps this is the most secret function of music, to give back to the body for a moment what reality has torn away. Today, centuries later, we may not remember the names of these musicians, nor the songs they played, but they still exist, hidden somewhere in the cracks of history, played not by fingers, but by memories, vibrating silently in the corridors of modern hospitals, where the sounds are different, but the need remains the same. The need for comfort that does not come in the form of a pill, but in present. A sound that says, without words, you are not alone. A string that, even if thin, continues to hold what the body does not yet know how to bear. Just one note, but enough. The night began like all the others, but there was something different in the air. A thicker silence. A cold that didn't come from the wind, but from within. The tent we were in seemed suspended in time, as if the world outside had forgotten to exist. Inside, the darkness was cut by small lamps, whose flickering flames seemed to hesitate in the face of pain. Bodies stretched out on bales of straw, voices hushed, eyes half closed. The air was thick, thick with fear, sweat, and a certain kind of resignation. But among all this, there was also sound. A light, persistent, almost shy sound. The sound of a flute or a poorly tuned lute that seemed to play not to entertain, but to hold on to what was still human. There, in that improvised war cellar, no one was completely awake, nor completely asleep. The line between reality and delirium was as thin as the skin covering a poorly healed wound. The music, with its repetitive and tonal note, was the only continuous element. It was like a thread that stretched between worlds, the world of pain and the world of memory. And it was this thread that we clung to, each in our own way. Some murmured along, as if the sound brought back a forgotten childhood. Others simply surrendered, eyes closed, like someone diving into a dark river, waiting for it to wash away everything that hurt. There were those who bit pieces of wood, and those who tore cloth between their teeth, but there were also those who simply took a deep breath and let their minds be carried away by the rhythm of the song. It was almost like an invisible dance, where the body remained still, but the spirit moved, and in this movement they found a kind of rest. Not relief exactly, but a suspension, a brief truce in the struggle between what one feels and what one endures. And strangely enough, it was this suspension that kept us alive, because pain, when felt in its entirety, does not allow for permanence. But the music diluted it. Sometimes the melody seemed to come from inside the tent itself. At other times, it seemed to float over the mountains, like the lament of ancestors. Nobody knew who was playing, and perhaps that's why it was easier to believe that it was time itself that made that lament sound. A time that no longer offered explanation, but still offered soundtracks. And between one chord and another, something inside us dissolved. The boundaries between skin and thought, between the name and the body, between now and everything that was left behind. The sound did not heal us, but it didn't hurt us either. It just existed, and in that existence, it created space so that we could continue. The hours passed slowly, as if the night itself were tired, and when the sound stopped or diminished, the return was always hard. Opening your eyes after a dive like that was like coming out of a frozen lake. Your body shivered, your mind resisted, and everything seemed heavier, colder, because the silence after the music had the taste of abandonment. It was there, at that moment, that many cried, not because of the pain of the surgery, but because of the absence of sound, for the loss of that floating world where, for brief moment, it was possible to be light, where pain was not yet a sentence, but just a distant shadow. Interestingly, many asked for the song again, even when they were already lucid, even when they knew there would be no more cuts, no more instrument, no more war. They asked for the same song, the same sequence of notes that, at some point, had led them to the other side of pain, as if that sound had become a talisman, an amulet against reality. And in a way, that's what he was, a bridge, a refuge, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, there was still beauty possible. And this beauty didn't need to scream. It was enough to whisper from time to time so that the heart would not forget to beat. Even today, on sleepless nights or in moments of anxiety, I find myself repeating that melody, not with my lips, but with my thoughts. And it is strange to realize how it still has the power to guide me, as if the past had not ended, but had merely changed form. The pain had changed, the war had changed, but the need for a sound to lull us, that remained. And perhaps it will always remain, because when all else fails words, medicine, and consolation, there is only sound. A sound that promises nothing, but that accompanies us, until finally, sleep takes us, like someone who slowly returns to a safe place. Today the hospital hallway glows with cold lights, and the sounds that echo are almost always predictable. Rhythmic foot-spaced beats, automatic doors opening smoothly. There is something reassuring about the technical routine of these spaces. Everything seems under control. The walls are clean, the air smells of mild disinfectant, and the voices are measured, professional. All it takes is a gesture or the touch of a button for someone to come. Someone who knows what to do, who carries not only knowledge, but a calm countenance. And this presence, this immediate response, is perhaps one of the greatest achievements of modern care, not the absence of pain, but the certainty it will be looked at. However, when you look deeper, you realize that this clinical organization carries an invisible memory. It lies beneath the clean sheets, among the labeled vials of anesthetic, in the detailed notes of each medical record. An ancestral memory of chaos, of improvisation, of desperation contained by desperately human gestures. Everything that is science today began as an attempt, Before technique, there was intuition. Before the sterilized scalpel, there was the knife boiled in water. And before clinical silence, there was sound. That fragile sound emitted by strings, flutes, or voices that sought to calm that which no hand could reach. It is in this contrast that the astonishment lies, because, at the same time that we marvel at the present, something in us recognizes the beauty of what came before. There is a silent part of the soul that bows before modern precision, but also misses ritual. The gesture was not efficient, but was affectionate, from the touch that did not follow protocol, but intuited the pain, of the sound that did not silence the scream, but accompanied it. And it is precisely this recognition that makes the experience of being cared for today so powerful, because, even without knowing it, we feel that we come from a place where this did not exist, where survival was almost always a miracle. In today's operating room, every detail is designed to reduce risk, pain, and suffering. Lights are positioned with precision. Equipment is calibrated. Teams are synchronized. But still, anxiety persists. Waiting, cold hand, staring at the white ceiling. Because the fear of pain has not disappeared with technology. It has simply transformed. And curiously, it is at this moment that the memory of a bygone time creeps in. As if, even surrounded by technology, the body is still waiting for something more. A sound, a presence that goes beyond function. Care that is not only efficient, but also tender. Something that echoes and remains. There is something deeply symbolic about the call button next to the bed. It represents, in a way, everything that was once an unheard cry, a plea made to the void, a call answered by echoes. Today, this button is small, simple, but powerful. It carries the certainty that pain will not need to be endured alone, that it will be shared, and more than that, it will be understood. Maybe not in its entirety, but at least in its urgency. And that, for those who are vulnerable, is healing enough, because knowing that one can be heard is, in itself, a form of relief. Still, there are times when clinical presence is not enough, in which pain, even when medicated, escapes through the pores of the soul. And that's when we miss something we can't name, a type of comfort that does not come from outside, but from within. Something that perhaps one day was given by a song, or by a story told at the foot of the bed, or by a shared silence. And in those moments, even in a modern bed, it is possible to hear in the depths of consciousness the sound of a lute, not as a souvenir, but as a memory inscribed in the body. A memory that says, "You've been through this before, and you survived." Modern care is a triumph, an extraordinary human achievement. But it is even more beautiful when it recognizes where it came from, when it understands that before science there was sensitivity, that before healing there was comfort, and that on many nights it was this comfort and this alone that sustained life. So, when you press the button to call the nurse, or hear the sound of the syringe being prepared, perhaps it is fair to remember the sounds that came before, of the anonymous musician, the battlefield troubadours, of the singers of pain, because, deep down, they are there too. Invisible, yes, but present, whispering, as they always have, that pain never had to be lonely. In a forgotten village among the hills, at a time when knowledge still walked barefoot, there was something strange happening. People, even those who were injured, waited for someone who did not bring herbs or instruments. He only brought a wooden box and a look that seemed to have already cried for all the pain in the world. It was the troubadour, not a doctor, not a priest, but someone who knew where to touch without touching. When he arrived, he didn't ask what the illness was. He would sit nearby and start playing. His music did not come to diagnose, nor to promise. She was coming to remember, to remind the body that it was still hope, that inside him there was still warmth, memory, longing. In the absence of anesthesia, scalpels and serum, art became the possible treatment. And it wasn't just music. Sometimes it was a story told in a low voice, a drawing made on the clay floor, an improvised dance with minimal gesture. What mattered was not the form, but the presence, the act of being there, whole, offering not a cure, but companionship. And perhaps that is the essence of what was done there, healing not the body, but the void that pain created, a void that opened up inside the patient, and that no medicine could fill, but art, that was what could reach. There was something profoundly wise in those practices, something that, to modern eyes, might seem useless, even ridiculous. But anyone who has faced their own fragility knows that sometimes what is most needed is not a solution, but a song, a symbol, a bridge that takes us back to a place where it doesn't hurt, or at least where it was possible to bear it. In times when death stalked homes like an inevitable wind, it was beauty that kept the soul anchored, and this beauty was not distant, unattainable. It was in the strings of an instrument, in the warmth of a narrative, in the touch of a human voice against the weight of silence. It's interesting to see how art, at that time, was not a luxury. It was a necessity, like fire, like water. She heated something that could not be seen, and when it became present, it changed everything. The wound remained open. The fever is high, but there were eyes shining. There was calmer breathing. There was something in the air that gave a name to hope. Not a hope for healing, but for meaning, because we don't always have to overcome pain. Sometimes you just have to understand it. Embrace her with words, with notes, with gestures. And in this, art has always had an advantage over science. Many of the healer artists were anonymous, pilgrims, lone travelers. They carried more stories than possessions on their backs. They were invited into homes where the doctor never arrived. They were remembered long after the pain had passed, because, in a way, what they left behind was not visible, but it was lasting. A chord that remained, a phrase that echoed, an image that appeared in dreams. And the most beautiful thing about all this is that they weren't looking for prestige. The exchange was enough for them. The relieved look of someone who, for a few minutes, wasn't just in pain. It was also a memory. It was also enchantment. Today, when I think about that time, I don't feel sorry. I feel reverence, because there was, in that simplicity, a wisdom that we sometimes forget. A wisdom that understands that not all suffering needs to be overcome with formulas. That sometimes you just have to be. Look into the eyes. Offer a sound, an image, a sentence, and trust that this will be enough. And surprisingly, it often was. Because what heals, in the end, is what remains when all else has failed. And art, in its fragility, is always the last resort, and the first that touches us. So as we look back on those times we call harsh, perhaps we should change our tune, not of criticism, but of listening. Because there is something there that we are still missing. Something that not all advances have been able to give us back. A sense, an everyday poetry. A care that does not depend on knowing, but on feeling. And if one day we need art again to survive not as a pastime, but as medicine, let it be ready. May we not have forgotten how to play it, how to receive it, how to let it inhabit our voids and remind us, once again, that we are more than pain. We are also beauty. Visualize with me a poorly lit room, in a village that doesn't appear on maps, where time slowly slips through the cracks in the boards. There is a man lying down, his face pale, his eyes half open as if waiting for something that will not come. The injured leg no longer responds. Doctors improvise with what they have, a cloth, a knife, a bucket of boiled water. Beside the bed, a young man holds a lute. It has no known name, nor elaborate techniques, just the instinct that your sound can offer more than silence. When your fingers touch the strings, something happens. It's not a miracle. It is presence. It's an invisible line that stretches between pain and hope. The sound that comes out of that instrument is not harmonious. It is old, perhaps out of tune, but it has a frequency that seems to tune directly to what still pulses in the injured body. The strings vibrate, and along with them, so does what remains of the dignity of the man who awaits the cut. Because there, in that anticipation of the end, it is not the muscle that suffers the most. It is the spirit, the memory, the fear of no longer being who one is. And then the sound insinuates itself like a shield. Fragile, it is true, but a shield. It does not stop time, but it offers a place where one can rest until the inevitable happens. And that, for those who feel the end approaching, is everything. It doesn't matter whether the improvised surgery saves the leg or not. The truth is that, many times, it didn't save. But there was something that was saved, the soul of that moment, the certainty that you were accompanied, that there was beauty even there. Among dirty cloths and rough instruments, the vibrating string held more than sound. She held the invisible, what no one could measure, but everyone felt. A type of connection that did not depend on words, nor faith, nor science. It was something more primitive, more pure. A thread that tied pain to hope, the end to memory, silence to meaning. And when later that patient closed his eyes, whether in death or in deep sleep, the sound still echoed, not in the ears, but inside, like a memory that settles in before it even becomes the past. Many, upon waking, did not remember the pain, not even the doctors, but they remembered the music of the sound repeated like a mantra, like a last embrace. And some, even in old age, asked to hear that same melody, not out of nostalgia, but because it took them back to a place where they were not alone, where a tuned string had told them, without a voice, I am here. This power of sound to sustain more than just notes is perhaps the most delicate metaphor in the entire history of pain, because it reveals that it is not the absence of suffering that saves us, but the way we are sustained during it. And anyone who has ever been sustained by music knows this. They know that there is a bridge in the vibration of sound, and that this bridge is, often, the only possible path between despair and continuation. That is why these strings were not just art. They were emotional structure. They were tracks along which the spirit could run even when the body stagnated. I think about the hands that played these instruments. Tired, dirty, calloused hands. But they still found the precision to caress the strings and make them a daily miracle. And I think about how many of these musicians died without knowing that, for many, they were more important than doctors. That they were the only ones to offer something that cannot be measured or prescribed, but that is essential. A caring presence, the sound that accompanies, the vibration that sustains the whole being when everything else threatens to break. And in that, there is no exaggeration. There is humanity. Today, we have sedatives, anesthesia, shiny operating, but we still need ropes. Not necessarily musical strings, but everything they symbolize. We need something to tell us we are not alone. May he sustain us in silence. May it vibrate with us even when everything seems silent. Because, in the end, what saves us is not just what heals us, but what accompanies us. And those real or symbolic strings are still there, waiting, tuned to remind us that there is still sound, even in the dark. And that sound holds, always held. Now that the last note has dissolved into the air and memory has followed ancient paths, only silence remains. But not a silence of absence, but rather of full presence. A silence that sounds like the distant echo of a forgotten lute, still vibrating within us. There is something that remains even after the story is over. A faint, almost imperceptible sensation that we have been touched by something soft, something that perhaps doesn't even have a name. And that's how all stories should end, not with a full stop, but with a sigh. A final chord that lulls, not to interrupt, but to rest. You may not remember all the details, perhaps the names of the melodies, the instrument. The scenes of pain and resistance escape your memory like sound escapes your fingers. But something remains. Something has settled in silence between the spaces of thought. Because that is the power of stories told to the rhythm of the heart. They do not teach exactly. They inhabit. They become part of the fabric with which sleep is sewn. And when you close your eyes after reading them, it is like entering a familiar dark room where you know where the furniture is, even without being able to see it. And if your eyes are heavy now, and your breathing has found a calmer rhythm, then perhaps this story has fulfilled its role, not to teach, but to accompany, to offer silent company as the day draws to a close, to remind you that, even in the most unlikely times, there were those who cared, there were those who played strings to hold souls, and that this, even in its simplicity, was more than enough. Because sometimes all you need is this, a sound to lull you, a story to sustain you, a calm voice that tells you, without saying it, you can rest. Good night. May the silence that now sets in be as full as the sound that preceded it. And if dreams come, may they come as soft notes vibrating slowly, holding your soul tenderly, until the next melody.